Alright, so in this video we will see how to assemble the engine. As you can see that I've cleaned all the parts. So first we will install the bearing on the crankcase, followed by the rubber seals, and I also have the new gaskets which we will need to assemble the engine. I will use this heat gun and I'll heat the crankcase. Meanwhile, I've also frozen the bearings overnight in the freezer, and after that I'll carefully place the bearing in the center and gently tap it with the socket. You can also use the old bearing and hammer it so that the bearing can sit flushly in the crankcase. Similarly, I'll heat the flywheel side of the crankcase. Installing the bearings is the most tedious part, because if you don't get the bearing right in the first place, then you'll have to again reheat the crankcase and freeze the bearing once more. You might have to try a few times. Nevertheless, once the bearings are in the crankcase, check if they feel smooth and lubricate them. Next, we will install the rubber seal, and I'll lubricate the seal as well so that we can install them easily. Now, when installing the seal, make sure that you don't press it all the way, especially on the flywheel side of the crankcase. Otherwise, the rubber seal will bind with the bearing and the bearing won't function smoothly, and that's going to add resistance to the crankshaft. Similarly, on the clutch side of the crankcase, now this half of the crankcase has a clip in it, so you can press the seal all the way. And very gently with the old bearing, I'll hammer the seal so that it's seated nicely. So I'll lubricate the crankshaft and gently install it in the crankcase assembly. Next, I'll grab the gasket, which we will need to place in between the two crankcase halves. I'll lubricate the gasket and place it on the clutch side of the crankcase. Now on this side of the crankcase we have these hollow pins, and this will basically hold the gasket and also lock the crankcase once it's assembled. And I would highly recommend you use a rubber sealant to seal the crankcase, because that's a more effective way of joining the two crankcase halves, and that way you won't have any air leaks or any compression problem. For the time being, I'll just use the gasket and proceed with the installation. Gently tap the crankcase so that it's seated well, and make sure to use some thread lock and then install the screws, because the engine will have a lot of vibration and you don't want the screws to get loose, otherwise your engine will basically fall apart. Then with the hobby knife we can cut the excess gasket. Next we can install the flywheel, and for the flywheel, if you remember, we have this small key which will basically engage the flywheel with the crankshaft. So place it like this, and align it with the slot that you see on the flywheel over here, and press the flywheel firmly so that it's seated all the way, and check if the key is actually engaging the flywheel and the crankshaft. Next we will install the clutch housing, and make sure that you install it in the right orientation. On the bottom side of the clutch housing we have this metal support. We don't want the clutch housing to be installed upside down. And secure this with the screws with the thread lock as well. After that, we'll install the nut which will secure the flywheel on the crankshaft, and apply some thread lock for this as well. So the bottom half of the engine assembly is almost done. We can now proceed to install the cylinder head. So lubricate the connecting rod and the small roller bearing that we see. Now when installing the piston, very important to make sure that the direction or the orientation of the piston is correct. On every piston, you will either have an arrow or a marking like this, which indicates that this side of the piston has to be facing towards the exhaust. If you invert the piston direction, it will basically spit the fuel out into the carburetor back, and it won't suck the air from the intake manifold. Slide the connecting rod. So once the connecting rod is in the center of the piston, the next challenging part is to install the retaining clips or the C-clips. Now sometimes you could have some trouble trying to install these. This could take a bit of practice to get it right. Use a tweezer or a needle nose plier for this. Here I have the piston ring. I'll lubricate this as well and install it. You should be able to install the piston ring quite easily. Once it's in place, make sure that the piston ring is also installed in the correct orientation. So you'll have this small hole on the piston like I said before. So make sure that the slit on the piston ring is aligned with the hole on the piston. And to install the piston smoothly and easily, I'll lubricate the piston ring, the piston and also the cylinder head from the inside. The cylinder head should smoothly slide over the piston ring. Next we will secure the cylinder head with the 2 bolts, and make sure to use thread lock for this as well. So our engine is almost ready. We just have to install the clutch, and for that we will need the piston stopper, which is why we had to install the cylinder head prior to this. So I'll install the piston stopper and grab the clutch mounting plate. I've applied thread lock for this screw as well. And firmly secure the screw for the mounting plate. And once the piston stopper is in place, we'll also torque the nut for the flywheel. After this, we can install the clutch. So these 2 screws, like I said, have this concave shims or washers, and they're directional. So make sure to install them in the correct order. And we also have 2 more washers or shims on the bottom side of the clutch, which will rest on the clutch plate. So install it correctly, and I've applied thread lock on these 2 screws as well. Next we will install the ignition system. So place the 2 plastic spacers, and to get the gap right for the flywheel and the ignition coil, I'll use this HPI card. Just rotate the screw a few times so that the ignition is in place. And rotate the flywheel so that it engages with the magnets and you can get the gap right. And tighten the screw for the ignition coil. Rotate the flywheel and make sure it does not bind or get in contact with the ignition system. You should be able to feel the pull from the magnets. Next we will install the intake manifold. And for that we will need the gasket. So this particular gasket will be installed in between the cylinder head and the intake manifold. So I'll lubricate this. The hole on the gasket should be aligned with the cylinder head. And then install the intake manifold correctly. Once the manifold is installed, I will install the carburetor, and for that also we have a gasket. So I'll lubricate this and place it over the manifold. And before you screw in the carburetor, make sure to grab the air filter mount, because that will be installed just in front of the carburetor. You'll also have a gasket for the air filter and the carburetor. So grab the two long screws and slide it through the carburetor. And then carefully mount the carburetor on the intake manifold and screw it in. So now our engine is almost assembled. We will now install the engine cover. So first I'll install the left side of the engine cover, which has the pull start. The top engine cover needs to be seated correctly because it has two slots, one on the front and the rear. I had some trouble getting it in place, so I removed the metal half of the engine cover. If the top cover is not seated correctly, it could bind with the flywheel and it could chip and get inside the engine, so that's not what you want. Secure the pull start with the 4 screws. Alright, so once the engine cover is installed, I'll begin to assemble the fuel tank. So I'll cut the fuel lines to the desired length. The black fuel line will be used for the clunk, and the yellow fuel line will return the excess fuel. So attach the clunk on the black fuel line and make sure it's a snug fit. Next I'll grab the rubber grommet for the fuel tank, and in order to slide the pipes easily through the hole, I've cut them at an angle like this so that it can slide easily. So once the fuel lines are installed, we can install the grommet on the fuel tank. Make sure that the yellow fuel line does not enter the fuel tank excessively. So firmly press the grommet onto the fuel tank and make sure it's seated firmly and nicely. So to install the engine easily and correctly, I will remove this center plastic roll bar mount, we can say. So we have 4 screws on the bottom, 2 on each side. We will have to remove those. And we should be able to separate it from the chassis. So as you can see that we can place the engine directly on the main chassis. But before that, we will install the fuel tank, and for that we have these 3 plastic tabs. Install these. And slide the fuel tank over it. And use the small body clips to secure the fuel tank in place. And at this stage I'll connect the fuel lines to the carburetor. So the black fuel line will go on the bottom and the yellow fuel line will go on the top. Next, to hold the engine in place, I'll mount this screw over here, which should hold the engine somewhat in its position. And after that, I'll roll the buggy upside down and install the 3 screws which hold the chassis and the engine together. Now 2 of the screws which are on the left side of the chassis need to be installed with the 2 concave washers. And while installing the screws, they should screw in freely and without any resistance. And where we have the clutch housing, to attach it to the chassis, we have this metal spacer. We will have to install that and then install the screw from the bottom. So that metal spacer will basically add support to the clutch housing. So once everything is in place correctly, begin to tighten the screws evenly, one by one. So we have mounted the engine on the chassis. Next I will install the exhaust. So for that we need to use the exhaust gasket. And mount the exhaust on the engine with the 2 long screws. Make sure that the screw goes in correctly and you don't accidentally thread the cylinder head or the fins on it. Pull the pull start and check for the spark. As you can see that the spark is alright, so we're good to go. Install the spark plug, tighten it and secure the cap. Next I will install the air filter mount. Alright, so once the air filter is in place, I'll add in some pre-mixed fuel just to get the engine running and test it. Press the priming bulb to prime the engine. And now finally let's check if the engine will fire up. Turn on the choke and wait for the engine to almost fire up. Turn off the choke lever at this point. So the engine is alive and it should fire up right away. And what a delight it is to hear the engine fire up. So the engine rebuild was successful and I'm quite happy with the result. And there we have it, guys. This brings us to the end of the Hpi Baja 5P engine rebuild process. As always, I hope you found this series helpful and informative. If this is your first time on my channel, please subscribe and do like this video as well. So thanks a lot for watching. Take care and goodbye.